Hello, I'm Tony Parsons, and welcome to the Tony Parsons Show. As a news broadcaster and journalist for the past 50 years, I've reported on the major news events that have shaped our nation. I've interviewed prime ministers, premiers, thought leaders, and other people of distinction from around the world. My goal with this interview series is to help you, my audience, discover the person behind the credentials, while at the same time, I'll invite them to share their professional insights, experiences, and aspirations. My guest today was first seen on television as a dancer during the mid-1960s. That was on CBC television, youth series such as Where It's At. She graduated from York University's Fine Arts program with an honors Bachelor of Arts. That was in 1973. A week after graduation, she joined CTV Television Network's news division, initially working as a junior secretary to news director Donald Cameron, my old boss, and then she later advanced to product manager, then research for W5, as well as reporting for CTV National News and Canada AM. In the 80s, she became anchor for the newscasts on Canada AM. That was in 1980, making her the first woman in Canada to hold a full-time position as a national news anchor. Then, in 1985, she became weekend anchor of CTV National News, a post she's held ever since. Sandie Rinaldo, it is something I've looked forward to for a while, having you on my show. Welcome.
Well, and you know something, I remember when you were a big star, a huge Pumbaa, I guess. Is that the correct phrase?
Well, thank
in
you.
Toronto. Pumbaa. Make sure I get the word right here.
Pumbaa? Okay.
Pumbaa.
I'll take Pumbaa.
CFGO Toronto. I mean, everybody looked up to you, and you were ahead of the curve in terms of breaking through that ceiling and becoming so well respected for what you did. So yes, it's very nice to be able to talk to you.
Nice to have you here with us, Sandie. 50 years you've been in the business. That's about as long as I was in it. And your opening lines for the television special, which I thoroughly enjoyed, it was tearful in spots, and it was called I'm Sandie Rinaldo. And you make the statement, people don't know who I am other than I say, I'm Sandie Rinaldo. There's a lot more to all of us when you dig deeper. So that sort of resonated with me because I'd really like to get to know Sandie Rinaldo. So first, let me ask you this. As someone usually asking the questions, how does it feel for you to be sitting in the guest chair?
Don't like it. Don't like it, Tony. Don't like it at all. I'm a very, very private person and was until I did this special to celebrate my 50 years at CTV. And it was the executive producer at the time, Rosa Wang, who said to me, it's time, Sandie, it's time for you to open up and let people know who you are. But you know this, Tony, as an anchor, we walk a very fine line in terms of objectivity. And so I kept my life private, largely because I am private, but also because I didn't want to bring anything to the table so that viewers might say, oh, she's got a particular bias as regards to this issue or that issue. I wanted to be absolutely objective. Objectivity is key. You know, even when we do our stories today, and you also know this, we bring in elements from both sides. Viewers will bring their own perspective to the story, and they may look at something that we think we're being objective about and say, no, you have a particular bias. But I think that largely explains why I kept my life private for such a long time. Yeah.
Mm. You explain that in the special, and I understand that, and you and I agree on that. But I want to talk about it because I enjoyed it, as I said so much. I became teary-eyed in several spots. And one of the things you did was you pay homage to your parents, Morris and Mary Bricks. You were an only child and seem to have had a wonderful relationship with your folks. Not everyone can say that, by the way. So what would you say was the greatest life lesson your parents ingrained in you?
I knew from the time I was very little that I was loved. And when you have that kind, when you're embraced by that kind of love, you're safe and able to take challenges in life, because I knew that if I took one step forward and failed, my parents would be there to say, don't worry, take two steps, take another couple of steps forward. So, my mother at the time was a nurse, which was unheard of when I was growing up as a child in the 50s. Most women stayed home. And so she really was a trailblazer. She was a nurse for a couple of reasons. My parents had very little money when they came to Canada from Europe after the Second World War. My mom had to work. My dad had to work as well. But they always wanted a parent around. So my dad worked during the day. My mom worked at night. So I always had a mother or a father with me. When my mother slept, I don't know, she took the night shift, but it's that being surrounded by love. And also based on my mother's experiences as a nurse, she taught me to listen. She taught me to be a generous person, to open my heart to others and to understand what others experience. But the key lesson I took away was listening, like really listen to what people have to say. I recall her telling me horror stories from some of the seniors that she worked with. And it actually, Tony, inspired my interest in doing investigations into senior abuse when I was with W5. And largely it was because in some of the places, people were just dropped off and families walked away. And my mom said, there's nothing more important that you can do than sit down with someone who's older and isn't surrounded by family and just listen to them, let them talk. And I think that's a lesson I took to heart. I really did. And perhaps that's something that I am passing on to my children as well.
Your mom and dad were Holocaust survivors.
Right.
And you really hadn't spoken publicly about that until this special. And you made the statement, I want my children and grandchildren to know that we are who we are because these two amazing people survived and walked away from the ashes of evil, walked away from horror, and did what they had to do so that I could have a life. That's what you said.
Yes.
And you've just underlined it.
Yeah. I mean, my parents went through hell. They both came from large families at the end of the Second World War. My mom had 10 brothers and sisters. The older ones were married and had children of their own. So it was a fairly substantive family. And there were only 3 survivors, my mom, her brother, and sister. My father also came from a large family. There were 5 boys. He was the youngest. The others were all married. They had children. They had extended aunts and uncles and families. My father believed he was the only survivor. And for as long as he was alive, that's all he knew. I mean, I was able to track down not too long ago someone that we believe is a niece of my dad's, but to come over to Canada after the war and to restart your life, to begin your life anew, I think that's what has perhaps influenced me more than anything else. When my parents came here, they came with nothing. They came on a ship, the HM Samaria. They landed in Quebec City. They were on a train. They came to Toronto. They had been sponsored by a family member. And at the time, there was no social safety net. You basically had to work. And that's what they did. They jumped into that right away. And they lived in rooming homes. And they wanted me to have a better life. And that's what they spent their lives doing.
And you are obviously grateful for that. I can tell in your voice and in that special and the things you said, the things you imparted, that you really do appreciate it. And that's wonderful. Your trip to Warsaw was one of the most poignant parts of that special. Tell me what it was like being there.
I wanted to see where my mom grew up. The building isn't there anymore. Warsaw was largely destroyed during the Second World War. And that building, she lived in an apartment with her family, and it was a huge apartment complex for the time, not by our standards, but back then. And so I wanted to walk in her footsteps. But for me, the most touching moment was going to where the remnant of the wall is that was engulfed an entire community within the Warsaw Ghetto. And I knew that the vast majority of my family on my mom's side were inside that ghetto. And starving. They were deprived of food. They were deprived of water, the basic necessities. My mom had managed to get out with my uncle's aid, and she became a courier. Through stealth of night, she would bring in supplies, bread, water, whatever she could. And this was prior to the brick wall being put up around. It was something like an 8 kilometer. I'm not at this point. I can't. I just want to make sure I have that right. But it was a huge wall that surrounded streets and streets and blocks and blocks and blocks of the community. And there was a little area where she had an opening through the barbed wire, and she snuck food in, and she was able to do that for quite some time. My uncle was able to essentially provide her with the goods that she was able to sneak into her family and other members of the community as well. So she fed as many as she could until she was stopped one day by a policeman who said, "I know what you're doing, and if I see you here again, you're done." So she escaped to Germany after that. And, I look at her and I look at her bravery, and I think about what she did. I think about what my father did as well.
I know you were proud of your mom, and I recall you saying in the special that area that she went through to get the food to other people was bricked up, and she
Yes.
couldn't ever get back in there again, and she had to go away, which is terrible in those times, especially terrible. But I'm going to ask you about your dad. I wonder what your dad's recollections were of the trials and tribulations he went through. He was put on the train to Treblinka death camps. Did he mention it to you? Did he talk about it?
So it's interesting. When I was growing up as a child, they did not talk about this at all. They wanted to normalize my life as much as possible. It was only years later when they began to share it with me, and in bits and pieces, Tony. It wasn't as if it all came out at one time. When their friends were over, I would hear them talking, and then I would ask questions. And there was one evening after, I recall this, I must have been about 10 or 11 years old. My father was talking about how he escaped, and I asked him about it, and his description was very evocative. He said he had been in a work camp, and he had heard that the Nazis were coming the next day to round up the community within a little town called Shidloviec. And he snuck out of the work camp to be with his parents. I don't know how he did that, but he managed to. And the entire community was forced to march 4 kilometers to the train station in Shidloviec. We actually, for the special, drove those 4K. I had a sense as I looked around where my father and his family were, and we arrived at the train station, and I know that my dad said they were all rounded up and put on the train, which was a cattle car. There was no place to move, no place to breathe. There was this little slat of a window, and that was it. And he knew they weren't going to make it out alive. Treblinka was the death camp. If you went there, you went there to be murdered. If you went to Auschwitz, there was a slight chance that you would come out of there alive. But in the final years of the war, the Nazis used Treblinka as their final solution. They wanted to murder as many Jews as they possibly could. And so my dad had an inkling. Word got around. And so he turned to his parents rather, and he said, "I am going to try to survive for you. I'm going to try to survive for you." He and 3 of his friends opened the little slate on this window, a grate rather. And as the train is moving along, I don't know how they got through it. It's tiny. I don't know if you've seen photographs or there's actually one representation, an actual train that's sitting on the grounds of Auschwitz. They pushed it open, and they forced their bodies through, landed on the ground as the train kept moving, and with Nazi bullets flying in their direction, my father and one friend were able to run into the forest and hide. And he says he just remembered looking at that train going off into the distance. And that was the last time he saw his parents, his brothers, their wives, their kids. That was it. He watched them go off into the distance, and they never returned. Yeah. So for me, going to Auschwitz for this special, was poignant, but going to Treblinka was a real punch. We were there on a snowy day, and it was very eerie. It was very quiet. And I knew that there were more than 1 million Jews buried there, the remains of the Jews. And I knew that somewhere on these grounds were family members that I never got to know. I would never know, right? And there were aunts and uncles and cousins. I would have had a huge family.
One of the most moving things in the special for me was watching you coming across the gravestones to the Bricks family in the cemetery. That was difficult. Then placing the small stone on top as a family tradition, those that carry on today, I can only imagine the emotions that you must have been feeling then.
You know, I did this for my parents. They survived. I wanted to say to them, I'm here because you survived. I'm a testament to your strength. And so the very fact that I was able to come back to a place that had provided such horror for them and come back there and say, you live on. You know, both my parents are gone. They live on in me. They live on in my children. They're going to live on in their children. It's tough. It's difficult for me to talk about it, Tony. It is.
I understand. I want to ask you about this. The Premier of BC, David Eby, has mandated that high school students in this province receive education of the Holocaust as part of the curriculum. How do you feel about that? Do you think this should be a national initiative?
100%. You know, I think as the years go on and we've lost most of those who survived, there's only a few voices left. There's nothing like hearing it from someone who's experienced it. You know, it's incumbent on the second generation to talk about it. Those of us whose parents were Holocaust survivors, which is why I went public with this. I think it's important never to forget, because there's so much horror going on in the world today. You know, you look at the Yazidi girls who were enslaved by ISIS and forced into marriage. You know, we're supposed to learn from the lessons of the past. Sadly, I don't think we have, but I think it's important to educate kids and make them know, because every year we move farther and farther away from something. Imagine 6 million people murdered because they're Jewish. How is it possible that kind of evil existed? And so in order to make it real for these young people as they grow older, I think we have to tap into the experiences of those who are still alive, who can share what it was like for them. And others as well. The second generation can talk about what it was like for their parents to go through this experience. I think we have to learn about this so that we can be better people, caring. You know, there's too much hate these days. And I think if we understand each other as people and we sit down and talk to those who are different than we are, who have different beliefs, different cultural beliefs, who have ideas that perhaps may seem foreign to us, the more we learn about them, the less foreign they are. You kind of break through and you make everybody a person instead of an anonymous group of individuals. If you reach out to someone and understand their humanity, then you're a far more sympathetic individual and far more caring and far more generous in spirit. So yes, I think what the Premier is doing is excellent.
It's obvious that you've had much tragedy in your life. And I'm sorry that you lost your child, Noah. You also lost the love of your life, as you described him, your husband, Michael, to cancer. That was in 2005. Tell me about him.
He was my best friend. I mean, we met when I was 20 years old. Mm-hmm. He was 25. And we married when we were young. We grew up together. We built a life together. We had 3 amazing young daughters. We laughed. And, you know, I think, Tony, and, you know, it's a question I suppose I could ask you too. You know, if you find someone and you really connect with them and they're not just your lover, your husband, your best friend, they're more than that. They're your confidant. How wonderful is it to connect with someone like that? How special is it to meet someone who gets you? And Michael got me. He was very, very proud of what I did. He encouraged me every step of the way. It's funny. Sometimes he would be introduced as Mr. Sandie Rinaldo, and he'd laugh. He was confident in his own abilities and very proud of me that it didn't matter to him whether he was Mr. Sandie Rinaldo or not. And part of the reason, more than part of the reason, certainly a significant reason for why I was able to do what I did is I walked out the door and knew my children were with someone who loved them, and again he enjoyed every single minute he had with those kids. So it made it easy for me to go to work on Saturdays and Sundays, right? In those days. Yeah.
I'm sure we're going to lighten up soon, but I just
Yes.
wanted to know from you. You shared your own personal battle with breast cancer. Why open up yourself to that?
Actually, I didn't for the longest time, largely because when it happened, which was 2 years after Michael passed away, I was very protective of my children. I didn't want this to have to be something that they would have to explain to people. I wanted it to be a shared experience within the family because we had just gone through losing their dad. And also my father was very old at that stage. I lost him when he was 99 years old. He lived a good full life. But the last thing I wanted for him after he had lost so much was to fear that he would be losing me. So I kept it quiet until the special. And then I thought, when we share these kinds of experiences, other people talk about their experiences and they share it with you. And, it's interesting when I went public with this in the special, I would get letters from women who said they'd gone through the same experience. And it made me feel good to know that I could make even a small difference in someone's life by talking about it.
Now, let's get to the career.
Okay.
The 50-year-old career.
50 years, yeah. How much longer have you been in the business? Or
I don't know.
I topped you. How many years, Tony?
50 plus. But I'm about the same. I'm 85 years old, so I was out of the business when I was 76. So
Right.
It's been almost 10 years since I just stopped doing this and started again.
Well, but it's interesting. Okay, all those years in the business, have you ever been asked, because it's a question as a woman I get asked all the time, how did you manage a career and a family life? And I have a small person coming in. Yes, my love. You want to come and sit in here? Okay.
Okay.
All right. We'll see how this works. Okay, so my question to you. Okay, we just saw how I balance this, right? Women always get asked, how did you balance a career and a private life? How did you do it?
I don't know. I just it just happened. I think I have no children. I have dogs. I've had dogs. I find them very manageable, and it's certainly not an impact on my career, but in any way. But I understand what you're saying, and you have to have an understanding partner to do what you and I did.
Right.
Sandie, I have this picture of you walking along Charles Street in Toronto in a white winter coat. You go into CTV and you strike up a conversation with my old boss, Don Cameron. What happens then?
Well, you remember, right? He was rough and tough on the outside, right? He started as a newspaperman. So, he was a journalist, true and true. And back then, men were men, men were journalists, and there were very few women within the inner circle. So I walked in and I sat down and he asked me questions. And with the naivete and brazenness of youth, when he asked me why should he hire me for this job, I said, because one day I'll be hosting Canada AM. And he started to laugh. And I guess I amused him sufficiently with my conversation that he said, okay, fine, whatever, come in Monday morning and you'll answer the phones. And that was it. I had my foot in the door for $90 a week, which was a windfall, let me tell you, at the time.
Sure.
A huge amount. I was just so happy to have my foot in the door and be given an opportunity to start at the network level, which is unheard of, absolutely unheard of. So I parlayed that into other jobs, one after another, but always on 3 months probation with Don. Like, you remember that about him, right, Tony?
Oh yes.
He would challenge you every step of the way. It wasn't going to be an easy ride.
This may be a good time to tell you what I'm reading right now.
Okay.
And it's Connie Chung's memoirs. Now, she says in her book, talking about sexism, she says, many men in television news, especially those who become anchormen, contracted a disease, big shotitis, she writes. It was characterized by the swelling of the head,
yes.
an inability to stop talking, self-aggrandizing behavior, narcissistic tendencies, unrelenting hubris, delusions of grandeur, and fantasies of sexual prowess. Now, what's your reaction to that? Did you experience any of that kind of thing when you were starting out?
Oh, you tell me, Tony. What is it like for you? How did you perceive yourself when you were a big man in Toronto, right, for so many years?
I always, I didn't have many co-anchors during my career, but the ones I had, including people like Pamela Martin and others, were just great, and I enjoyed working with them. And if I'm like you, if I look around now, I see more women in broadcasting than I've ever seen before, I think. More anchors, more. So maybe the landscape is getting a little better.
I could count the number of women on one hand when I started at CTV. Certainly at the network level, there were more in local news. But I remember the morning that I was given an opportunity to anchor Canada AM News for the first time. And through the CFTO studios, there was a buzz. A woman is going to read the news. A woman. It was like this strange creature from outer space was going to read the news. Craig Oliver once told me there was a handbook, and I haven't seen it yet. And I've been trying to get my hands on it in the 1950s that said women on radio. Women anchors did not have the gravitas that men did because their voices are higher, right? So, what did that mean? We have to lower our voices to have that kind of manly approach. But yeah, I mean, how things have changed so much. I mean, really, when I made the move to be an anchor on Canada AM and then on national news on the weekend, and when I began filling in for Lloyd, people called me a trailblazer because there were so few of us. You could count the number of us on one hand, as I said before. Now you look around, it's not a question of man, woman. It's a question of who's best qualified to do the job. So I think things have changed dramatically since I first began all those years ago. And such a good thing, such a good thing. I mean, there was what they call the pink ghetto, which is where you had a lot of women go in order to get entry-level jobs into the business. And that was answering the phone. That was doing exactly what I did at the time. Now, things have changed so dramatically that, you can have man, woman, whoever is best qualified to answer the phones, right? That's the way it is.
I just sitting here thinking about what my father expected of me I think he wanted me to be a lawyer. He never quite understood that I took a career as a journalist. How did your parents feel about your career with the CTV? Were they happy for you? Did they applaud what you did?
Well, I think like your folks, they didn't understand television. It was this strange thing. And when I first started, they were quite worried. My mother, in fact, suggested I get a part-time job in a doctor's office as a medical secretary because she felt this TV thing wouldn't last and I'd need something, safe and secure to fall back on. I remember talking to one of our writers. He said his parents thought he was a typist because when he said, he explained, what do you do in the business? He said, I'm a writer. It took a while. I think once they saw me on television, they got it. And certainly afterwards, my parents had a shrine to me in their home. There were pictures of all the news articles that appeared in the newspaper and in magazines and that kind of thing. It took a while. Well, what about your folks? Did they finally get over the fact that you weren't going to be a lawyer?
Never got over it. My dad didn't. My mom maybe did. She was proud that she could turn on her TV set and find me there somewhere. So, but it was okay. I want to know about interviews because they're an important part of what we did in the time. Did you have a favorite interview subject?
I'm going to tell you about William Shatner. So there's two parts to it. The first time I had been asked by the vice president of entertainment to interview Bill Shatner, who had a new show on CTV, and he was coming through because he was promoting an investment of his in an upstart tech company. And that was brand new at the time. Now we're familiar with this kind of thing. Back then it wasn't. But we were only given 10 minutes to speak to him. He was late because he was coming down the highway. And so there was traffic. Our 10 minutes became 9 and 8 and 7. Eventually we only had 5 minutes. And when he sat down to speak to us, he started talking about his investment. And I had been told he would talk to me a little bit about growing up in Montreal and how important it was for him to be a Canadian. So I saw an opening when he said it's important for us to invest in Canadian companies. I said, aha, I grabbed on it. He said, Canadians take pride in your successes, and we see you as one of us, even though you're an American. Talk to us about your experiences. I was more specific in my questioning, and he ripped off the mic and he left. And I thought, well, if there's any interview I want to revisit, it's Bill Shatner all those years later, which I did. So all those years later for the special, we went down to California. He agreed to be interviewed. He didn't remember me at all, didn't remember that experience, but it was just as irascible, but in a charming way. And, my line is at the beginning of the interview, I didn't have him at hello, but I had him at goodbye. So that was good.
I know you talked to Justin Trudeau earlier on in his success as a politician. I think he was shirtless at the time, wasn't he, when you interviewed him?
So I'd gone to interview Margaret Trudeau in Montreal because she had started to go public about her mental health issues. And she was very candid, gave me a wonderful interview. Unexpectedly, Justin showed up and he had just returned from a hiking trip. So he was wearing a vest with no shirt underneath, cut off shorts. And I took advantage of the opportunity and asked him, about his career as a teacher. And then I asked him about his relationship with his parents. And he said, oh, I'm not going to talk about that. At which point I said, very much the politician already. He said, no, never, multiple times, never. And years later for this special, when I interviewed him, he laughed about it because, never say never, right? He ended up in politics, as we all know so well. But there was evidence of a young Justin denying the fact that he would ever go into politics.
Celine Dion, how did you get along with Celine?
Very well. At the time, her husband, René Angélil, was a powerhouse, and people, had called him the puppet master, and that he controlled the strings. When I spoke to her, she was charming, lovely, talked about her career and her love of him, René, and how much she wanted children. And she was very candid. Celine is always very candid when she speaks to you. It was interesting to sit down and talk with René because, I put it to him. I said, people say that you tell Celine, essentially, you control the strings. He said, oh, no, she's an independent woman. She knows her own mind. And she responded by saying, yes, I am, and it was interesting to see the two of them together because it's very rare to have them both in the same room at the same time. They're generally interviewed separately. So that was a nice moment for us, a bit of a coup.
Bob Marley's name crops up here. Tell me about the Marley interview.
Oh, that's one I would like a do-over. I was very young, in my mid-20s, and I had been given the assignment by a producer who said, and you have to keep in mind, this was the 70s, right? Where we were far more uptight as a society than we are today. And I was told by a producer to take him to task on his support and his use of marijuana. And so I did. But when I look back at it now, it looked as though I was taking too tough an approach and not really giving him the respect he deserved and deserves as an astonishing talent and as an amazing performer. And I understand so much more now than I did back then. So as I said, I wish I had another opportunity. Sadly, he's not with us today, but the interview would have been completely different. That's what happens when you're young and naive, right? You make mistakes.
Sure.
You learn.
Did you learn anything with Prime Minister Diefenbaker? His name is on my list as well.
Yes. Well, one of my first interviews, you get thrown into a situation where you're talking to a brilliant man,
Mm-hmm.
and I should have been warned in advance that he does tend to go on. So I asked a question, and he went on and on. I've subsequently learned how to interrupt and do it respectfully. But yes,
I had the same thing happen to me with him. I guess it was the way he ran things in his own mind, and he just, he didn't want you taking over in any way.
Well, what's your favorite interview over the years? What would you say jumps to the top of the list?
Sandie Rinaldo.
No.
Yes.
Very smooth. Very smooth.
No, I did quite a few, as you did in your half century. There were some I can remember the ones I didn't like very much, and most of them were politicians.
Oh, yeah?
I found them argumentative. I found them a bit of a cop-out, a lot of them, and the party line was always there, and it irritated me, because you only have a certain amount of time to get your point across and to get their point across, and I thought it was sometimes a waste of time.
What was there one that jumped out at you? Was there one more than any other?
Pierre Trudeau.
Ah, okay.
Never got along with him, and he was curt. He was sort of a know-it-all attitude that he had, and it bothered me, and I maybe tried it 3 or 4 times, and it always ended out the same. He just got a little snippety, and he almost walked away like Shatner did. Maybe they got that together. I don't know. Anyway.
Well, would you like a do-over with him now that you have? I mean, obviously, we'd have to go back in time, decades, but would you, with the knowledge of your age now, would you do it differently if you had a chance to?
You know what? I would. I would take time to do it. I would sit him down at a desk and make it a conversation more than an interview. And I think that would have worked with him, because I think that's what he wanted most of all, was a conversation.
Yeah. The trick with politicians, and I'm sure you'll agree, is, you want to get from them, you don't want them to spout the party line. You want to dig a little deeper and get something personal, something more evocative. And that's a challenge, as it's a challenge with all of us who, are the ones who are more accustomed to asking the questions than giving the answers, right?
True, yeah. Well, here we are. And it's been a blast. Thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed spending time with you. And I can only ask that you come back again sometime, and we'll spin a few more yarns for our folks. Can I say you're approaching retirement, or are you not even contemplating?
You know what? I'm loving this new job. It came quite unexpectedly after almost 38, 39. I've lost track of how many years, almost 40 years of doing the weekend news. They offered me this 5:30 newscast, and it was a chance to start something brand new and be creative. And I'm loving every minute of it. So I suppose for as long as they want me, and as long as I'm able to put sentences together, I'll be there.
Sandie, thank you so much. We'll see you again, I hope.
Okay. Be well. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to The Tony Parsons Show, recorded and produced by Mike Peterson at 85 Audio in Kelowna, British Columbia. To learn more about today's guest, please visit our website at thetonyparsonsshow.com. You can reach Tony directly via email at info@thetonyparsonsshow.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, we would greatly appreciate your support. Please consider leaving us a 5-star rating or review on your streaming platform of choice. Join us again next week for a new episode featuring Dr. Bonnie Henry.